This game went from vaporware to a competent game that addressed everything wrong with the original, yet nobody's talking about it. I'm part of Deep Silver's creator collective, and I'm a really big fan of Dead Island, so I was super hyped when they offered me a key to be able to play Dead Island 2, but I was really surprised when people in my chat were letting me know that they had no idea the game was stuck in development hell for about 8 years. So let's talk about it. If you were too young or just weren't around during the hype, Dead Island 1's announcement trailer made huge waves in the gaming community. The Dead Island 1 announcement trailer is based around a little girl and her family in the last moments that they live as the island is being taken over by zombies. It also plays in reverse, so it really messes with your emotions as you see her last moments, and it slowly reverses into the moments that she was happy before everything fell apart. Now keep in mind that this was during a time that the zombie craze was at an all-time high, so everybody was excited for these new zombie games, and Dead Island promised to be a game that was going to be full of emotional moments, making you feel really invested in the story. And then they released it. If you looked up oversold in the dictionary, you might see a picture of Dead Island next to it. The game not only ignored everything that was shown in the trailer, but it basically just broke down to a bunch of fetch quests. Go here, grab that, bring it back. Rinse and repeat. The world was big, but there were no reasons to explore. You also had a hard time trying to connect with friends, and the graphics, even at the time, weren't that great. But despite all this, there was a huge fan base behind the game, so much so that Deep Silver released a whole bunch of spin-off games just to keep people happy. 3 years later, we were treated to an announcement trailer to a proper sequel to Dead Island, and it made huge waves. This new trailer wasn't as dark and gritty as the original trailer was. Instead, it was more tongue-in-cheek, with a runner who was enjoying his time and completely oblivious to the whole world falling apart around him, which seemed to suit the theme of Dead Island a hell of a lot better. And then, radio silence. But that's not really rare. A lot of developers announce a game and then you just don't hear anything for a while until they're ready to show you what progress they've made. But what was rare about Dead Island is it had been in development for about 3 years, and then Deep Silver announced that the developers were no longer going to be working on this game. Rumor has it that Deep Silver pulled the plug because Dead Island 2 felt more like a spin-off rather than a proper sequel. People had kind of resigned to the idea that Dead Island 2 was dead, and about a year after their announcement, the game leaked, and everybody saw that Deep Silver was probably right. It felt more like a spin-off, and it had some cool ideas, but it didn't feel fresh. It just felt like it was rehashing old ideas all over again. And things only get crazier, because shortly after this leak, Deep Silver announced that Sumo Digital was going to take over development of Dead Island 2, and they were going to rework everything that was already there, so not to worry because Dead Island 2 was still in the works, so fans got excited all over again. And once again, radio silence. For the next 3 years, Deep Silver would occasionally answer questions, but it very quickly turned into them just repeating the same answer. The development of the game is still ongoing. So people started to get a little weary, thinking that this was their way of trying to shut everybody up because the game was in a lot more trouble than they were letting up. And after 3 years of pretty much no answers, a financial report came out for THQ, which proved everybody's biggest fears. Not only was the game at a standstill, but Sumo Digital was no longer in charge. It turns out that the game was in a lot more trouble than Deep Silver was willing to admit. So by now, everybody had pretty much resigned themselves to the idea that Dead Island 2 was doomed to be vaporware, alongside with Scalebound and, at least at the time of this video, Beyond Good and Evil 2. But people didn't really know what was going on behind the scenes. While everybody was lamenting the loss of Dead Island 2 and had lost hopes that Deep Silver would ever pull through, it seems like Deep Silver hadn't given up. But they decided that they were no longer going to look for outside developers to help them make this game. Instead, they took the reins and sent it to their in-house developers at the German development company, Jaeger. And all of a sudden, we got a trailer with a release date for the game. So gamers were excited, although we were all still pretty skeptical because even though this time we finally had a release date, we had been promised a release of Dead Island 2 twice, and it had fallen through twice. So we weren't sure if it was really going to happen. Not to mention, we were all very aware of what had happened with Duke Nukem Forever and 2 Human. Both were games that were stuck in development hell for many years, and once they were released, everybody realized that not only were they below expectations, but they were objectively just bad games, and we didn't want the same thing to happen with Dead Island 2. So what happened? Dead Island 2 released, and on time, but it did get mixed reviews. This is only my opinion, so take it with a grain of salt, but I think the mixed reviews had a lot to do with people already expecting the game to be a failure, rather than a reflection of how good the game turned out. From the videos that I watched that gave Dead Island 2 a less than stellar review, it seemed like they were really fixated on the fact that it was a hack and slash zombie game. Like they were expecting it to be the next Last of Us, which just shouldn't be the case because that's a really unfair comparison for a game like Dead Island 2. Look, I'm not going to turn this video into a whole review. I understand that hack and slash zombie games are not everybody's cup of tea, but that's what Dead Island 2 is. if you're going into this game thinking you're gonna have an experience like The Last of Us, you're gonna be sorely disappointed. In my opinion, Dead Island 2 is exactly what Dead Island 2 should have been. It took everything that was wrong with the first game and fixed it, and then implemented a bunch of new stuff, like the new damage engine that they're using for the zombies, which is really impressive if you ask me. I'd go so far as to say that Dead Island 2's development hell was to its benefit rather than its detriment, because if Deep Silver had released the original version of the game, it would have just been forgotten, or it could have completely flopped, killing the whole franchise. But instead, Deep Silver set a really high bar. And yes, it meant that it had to go through 3 separate developers and it had to be dragged on for many more years than expected, but we got a game that was actually worthwhile. I think Dead Island 2 is a really interesting game, but I think the development story is just as interesting. And Deep Silver was able to prove that even if a game is going through development hell, it doesn't exactly mean that the game is destined to be a failure.